Forget the movie monsters. Egyptian mummification wasn't about curses. It was about preserving the soul's chance at eternity, with a mix of science, ritual, and serious craftsmanship. And what they pulled off over 3,000 years ago still blows modern minds. To understand why the ancient Egyptians went to such incredible lengths to preserve the human body, you have to step into their worldview. A world where death wasn't the end, but just the beginning of another eternal journey. See, to them, you didn't just die and disappear. You became something more, but only if your body was still intact. The soul wasn't one single thing either. It was a team effort. There was the ka, your life force, the ba, your personality, the ak, your transformed spirit that could move between the realms of the living and the dead. And all of these parts needed the physical body to return to. Without that anchor, you were doomed to wander. So mummification wasn't vanity, it was survival. If your body decayed or got destroyed, your spirit had nowhere to live. You'd miss your shot at paradise, what they called the field of reeds. It was like a cosmic version of rural Egypt. Rivers, crops, peace, everything you loved, but perfect. That's why early Egyptians buried their dead in shallow pits in the desert. The dry sand naturally preserved the flesh. But once tombs and coffins came into play, that natural mummification stopped working. So they had to take preservation into their own hands. And that kicked off a race against rot. A sacred mission to fight time itself, not for glory, but for eternity. Long before embalming became an art form, mummification was actually a happy accident. In prehistoric Egypt, people buried their dead directly in the hot desert sand. No coffins, no sarcophagi, just bodies curled up like they were sleeping. And thanks to the blazing heat and bone-dry climate, those bodies didn't rot. The sand sucked the moisture out so fast, bacteria didn't even get a chance to move in. Nature did all the work. But as Egypt got richer, tombs got fancier. People began burying their dead in mud-brick tombs and wooden coffins to show respect, status, and wealth. Ironically, those well-meaning upgrades ruined the natural preservation process. Once the body was sealed away from the drying desert air, it started to decompose. The same elite burials that were meant to honor the dead were now destroying them. That's when the early embalmers stepped in. Around 3,500 BCE, we start seeing the first signs of artificial preservation. They didn't have a how-to manual, just generations of trial and error. Herbs, oils, resins, whatever worked to slow down decay and stop the smell. Slowly, preserving the body became a deliberate act, not just a side effect of nature. By the time the Old Kingdom rolled around, mummification had already become a spiritual science. Entire families of embalmers passed down their knowledge like a sacred recipe. And the desert wasn't the hero anymore. Humans were now the architects of eternal life. If you died in ancient Egypt and your family had the means, your journey into the afterlife began immediately, and it would take a full 70 days. That's not a random number. It aligned with celestial cycles, symbolic purification, and the time needed to prepare both body and soul for eternity. The process was run by skilled embalmers, many of whom were temple priests. This wasn't backroom surgery, it was sacred theater. The body was brought to the place of purification, often near the Nile. There, the priest embalmers, sometimes wearing Anubis masks, would begin the delicate work. First came the washing, usually in palm wine or Nile water mixed with herbs. Then the physical transformation began. Organs were removed. The body was stuffed and packed with natron, a natural salt mix, to dry it out. This drying phase alone took 40 days. Afterward, the body was re-washed, restuffed with linen or sawdust, and perfumed with resins and oils. But here's the part Hollywood always misses. This wasn't just body prep, it was soul prep. During each step, rituals were performed. Prayers were spoken, spells were recited from the Book of the Dead. The embalmers weren't just preserving a corpse, they were protecting the spirit's journey. And when the body was finally dry, preserved, and wrapped in sacred linen, one final ceremony was performed: the opening of the mouth. It symbolically restored the senses so the dead could speak, eat, and see in the next life. This wasn't medicine, it was resurrection. All right, let's get into the part everyone secretly wants to know. How did they actually do it? And yeah, it gets a little gnarly. Step 1. The brain. It had to go. Egyptians believed it wasn't important for the afterlife, which is kind of hilarious considering how much modern science worships it. So they removed it through the nose using long hook tools. No, they didn't just yank it out in one piece. It was more like scrambling eggs in a shell, then draining the goo. Gruesome? Definitely. Effective? Absolutely. Next came the internal organs. A small incision, always on the left side of the abdomen, was made, and the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were carefully taken out. Each organ was individually embalmed and placed into its own canopic jar, protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The jars weren't just storage, they were spiritual guardians. But then comes the big question: what about the heart? Some texts say it was removed and wrapped separately. Others suggest it was left inside because Egyptians saw it as the seat of intelligence and emotion. The truth? It depended on the period, the person, and the embalmer. The entire abdominal cavity was then washed with palm wine and packed with natron, sometimes even filled with resin-soaked linen or fragrant sawdust to hold shape. They weren't just cleaning a body, they were turning it into a sacred vessel, one that had to last forever. This is where the real magic happened, turning flesh into something that could survive thousands of years. The secret weapon? A salty, chalky, naturally occurring substance called natron. Natron is basically the ancient Egyptian version of a preservation supermix. It's made of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. In short, it's drying power on steroids. They found it in dry lake beds, like Wadi Natron in the desert, and it became the MVP of mummification. Once the organs were removed, the body was completely covered and stuffed with natron. Every crease, cavity, and corner had to be packed. Then came the waiting game, 40 full days of total desiccation. During that time, the natron would pull every last drop of moisture out of the body. Bacteria can't grow without water, and decay can't start without bacteria. So this step was everything. Afterward, the body looked gaunt, dark, and rigid, but it was preserved. Not just dried like jerky, but chemically stabilized in a way that could last centuries. Even today, mummies from thousands of years ago still have fingernails, hair, and facial features intact. And this wasn't just a biological win, it was a spiritual one. In Egyptian belief, purification through drying mirrored the sun's own power over decay. The body wasn't just being preserved, it was being sanctified. This was science with a soul, a ritual of dehydration that transformed a corpse into a timeless relic of the divine. After the body was dried, preserved, and purified, the final phase began, the wrapping. And this wasn't just bandages and knots. This was sacred architecture built out of linen and resin, layer by layer, spell by spell. First, the embalmers coated the body in rich oils and resins. These weren't random substances. They used ingredients like myrrh, frankincense, cedar oil, and even bitumen. Resins helped preserve the flesh further, but they also had spiritual weight. Their scents were thought to ward off evil and purify the air between this world and the next. Then came the linen. Not just any cloth, carefully woven, sometimes inscribed and layered in precise symbolic order. Fingers and toes were wrapped individually. Amulets were placed strategically between layers, scarabs over the heart, the eye of Horus near wounds, protective spells sewn into place. In many cases, the embalmers recited prayers or chants during wrapping. They were literally sealing the body with words of power. And then came the grand finale, the opening of the mouth ceremony. Using special tools, a priest would symbolically reopen the senses, allowing the dead to breathe, speak, eat, and see in the afterlife. It wasn't about superstition, it was about agency. The soul had to be whole, and now, with the body restored, it was ready. The wrapped mummy was placed in a coffin, often nested inside multiple layers, like a divine Russian doll. The journey wasn't over, but the transformation was complete. From flesh to forever, one wrap at a time. For centuries, people saw mummification as a mystical riddle, wrapped in mystery, dipped in resin, and sealed in stone. Early archaeologists and Victorian collectors treated it like a sideshow. unwrapping mummies in public, grinding them into powder for mummy medicine, even selling strips of linen as souvenirs. But in the last few decades, science finally slowed down, zoomed in, and started asking smarter questions. One of the biggest breakthroughs came from CT scanning. Instead of slicing into priceless bodies, researchers could now peer inside without a scratch. What they found wasn't always what they expected. For instance, not all mummies had their organs removed. Some had no brain extraction at all. Others were packed with hundreds of tiny amulets or had gold leaf applied inside the wrappings, signs of regional or class-based variation. In 2023, a groundbreaking study published in Nature examined embalming ingredients at Saqqara and revealed complex recipes using imported oils, some possibly from as far as Southeast Asia. This meant Egypt's embalmers weren't just artists or priests, they were global chemists. They've even uncovered embalming workshops with labeled pots, recipes, and instructions. Turns out the process wasn't always cloaked in divine secrecy. It was industrial, specialized, and deeply systematic. And then there are the mummified animals: cats, crocodiles, ibises. Some were buried in mass graves, products of temple economies selling spiritual offerings by the thousands. What we thought was a uniform ritual, it was actually a flexible, evolving science, adapted over millennia. For something rooted in sacred rituals and spiritual science, mummification has had a pretty wild ride in pop culture. And not always in a good way. Somewhere between the mummy movies, Halloween costumes, and 19th century freak shows, the original meaning got buried under layers of fantasy, fear, and straight-up colonial exploitation. In the 1800s, European elites were obsessed with all things ancient Egypt, but they didn't treat it with respect. They treated it like a curiosity cabinet. Mummies were auctioned off, unwrapped at parties, and even ground into powders to be sold as miracle medicine. Egyptian corpses, once revered as vessels of eternal life, were reduced to spectacle, or worse, souvenirs. And Hollywood didn't help. It turned mummies into monsters, shambling corpses wrapped in curse-ridden cloth. The deeper truths about why the ancient Egyptians mummified their dead, completely lost in translation. What was once a deeply human attempt to preserve identity, memory, and the soul was now just scary background noise. Even museum exhibits weren't innocent. For years, mummies were displayed with little context. No names, no stories, just artifacts on shelves. Thankfully, modern curators are starting to shift the narrative. Now, many institutions are working with Egyptian scholars to reframe these individuals not as curiosities, but as people. Because that's the truth, every mummy was a person with loved ones, fears, and hopes for an eternal future. They weren't monsters, they were dreamers who dared to outlast time itself. Mummification wasn't magic, it was meaning. A blend of devotion, science, and soul-deep belief that life didn't end with death. These weren't just preserved bodies, they were preserved identities. People who hoped, planned, and prepared for an eternity they believed they could reach, if only the body stayed whole. If this journey into ancient preservation lit up your curiosity, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history's overlooked brilliance, and drop a comment. Which part of the mummification process blew your mind the most? Until next time, stay curious, stay human, and honor the past.